Hello, everyone, and welcome virtually to the Wichita Art Museum. I am Tara Hedrick, WAM Curator, and I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight, if even just through screens. And I'm even more excited that the day is inching ever closer when we can be together again in person. And tonight we have a wonderful evening planned with Dr. Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw, Chair of the History of Art Department at the University of Pennsylvania, as she speaks to us about the work of Sargent Johnson. Dr. Shaw is here in conjunction with the exhibition African American Art in the 20th Century, which is currently on view behind me, as you can see, and features nearly 50 paintings and sculptures by 34 leading artists, including a sculpture by Johnson. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the generous sponsors of African American art in the 20th century. The exhibition is organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The CF Foundation in Atlanta supports the museum's traveling exhibition program, Treasures to Go. The William R. Kennan Jr. Endowment Fund provided financial support. The Wichita presentation of the exhibition has been generously underwritten by presenting sponsors Koch Family Foundation and Emprise Bank. Generous support has been provided by Louise Beren, Berry Foundation, DeVore Foundation, Sharon and Alan Feary, Sonia Gredeman and Chris Bruner, Gridley Family Foundation, Kristen and Will Price, and Julie and Bill Nicholson. 2021 exhibitions and public programs are generously supported by the Downing Foundation. And of course, all museum exhibitions receive generous sponsorship from the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum and the City of Wichita. And WAM in this season, this spring, is also partnered with the Ulrich Museum of Art at Wichita State University and the Kansas African American Museum, which are also currently offering fantastic slates of exhibitions and programs celebrating 20th and 21st century African American artists. Tonight's speaker is Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw. Dr. Shaw is the class of 1940 bicentennial term chair in the History of Art Department at the University of Pennsylvania, where she first joined the faculty in 2005. Prior to her time at Penn, Dr. Shaw received a PhD in art history from Stanford University and then served on the faculty at Harvard University. She has also served as the senior historian and director of research, publications, and scholarly programs at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. Dr. Shaw researches the art and culture of the United States with an emphasis on issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. She is an extraordinary scholar, and a recitation of a list of her publications and her exhibitions and her awards and her honors would keep us here all night. In 2020 alone, she organized the exhibitions Every Eye is Upon Me, First Ladies of the United States, and Her Story, A Century of Women Writers, both for the National Portrait Gallery. She also published the chapter African American Artists and Mexican Muralism in the book Vida Americana, Mexican Muralism in the United States, published by the Whitney Museum of American Art and Yale University Press. Her exhibition, I Dream a World, Selections from Brian Lanker's Portraits of Remarkable Black Women, is upcoming at the National Portrait Gallery. And tonight, Dr. Shaw will help us dive deeper into the work of Sargent Johnson, whose sculpture Mask is currently on view just around the corner, and so just outside of your eyesight. And I should add that Dr. Shaw is happy to take questions after the talk, which she'll take from the chat feature. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shaw to our screens.
Thank you so much, Tara. It's really great to be here. Virtually is almost as good as in person. I'm going to share my presentation with you here. So I'm just going to jump right in, and if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll start with those. And then hopefully we can have a nice conversation for 15 minutes or so at the end. Okay, Sargent Johnson was the most highly lauded and successful African-American artist of a generation that came to prominence during the period between the two world wars. During that era, he participated in more exhibitions and received more prizes, awards, and commissions than did Aaron Douglas, Archibald Motley Jr., or any number of artists who are today better known and more widely celebrated. Johnson belonged to the elite San Francisco Art Association and served on its council board for several years. He received numerous awards from the SFAA, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Harmon Foundation, which was the most prominent institutional support for Black artists in the 1920s and 30s. Johnson's works of art were also featured in international expositions, reproduced in national magazines, and in foundational art historical texts, and they inspired numerous artists in their own work. His large-scale public works made under the auspices of the Federal Art Project during the late 1930s and early 1940s remained focal points in public buildings in the San Francisco Bay Area where he lived and worked. And here I show you the artist working on a model for the monumental cast stone frieze for the athletic field at George Washington High School in San Francisco's Richmond district. Johnson's artistic production is dynamic and complex, and his personal story is uniquely compelling. Both reveal deep contradictions about what it meant to be an artist of African and European descent, working within racial subject matter in the United States in the mid-20th century. And here I show you two different photographs of Johnson that were taken in his Oakland, California studio on the same day in 1935. In each photo, the artist holds a sculptural head of a woman, both with African features, but one made from a light-colored cast stone and the other from a much darker glazed terracotta. These staged photos point to Johnson's well-publicized interest in being viewed as an artist who was equally concerned with craft as he was with racial representation. He has been repeatedly cited by scholars as expressing a desire to celebrate Blackness and African American life. Quote, I aim at producing strictly a Negro art, he told a newspaper in 1935, studying not the culturally mixed Negro of the cities, but the more primitive slave type as existed in this country prior to the period of slave importation. A straightforward enough statement, yes, but a provocative one, given his own background as the son of Eliza Jackson, an African-descended woman who had been born into slavery, and Anderson Johnson, a man who physically read as white and was very likely of Swedish descent. Sargent Johnson may have said that he wanted to produce a strictly Negro art, but what he actually made through his career was art that evoked the experience of the more culturally mixed Negro that he supposedly eschewed. Johnson, who self-identified as African American, was often mistaken by others as white. He had at least one sibling who broke from the family altogether and passed into whiteness in his late teens. And Johnson frequently made art that, like his own body, was racially ambiguous. This practice may have allowed him to both hide and reveal the challenges of transcending the limiting racial designations of white and Black, Negro and American. To better understand the racially ambivalent artistic practice of Sargent Johnson, today I will discuss his efforts at creating African-inspired copper masks in his personal artistic practice and a number of lithographs that he made at the Federal Art Project's print workshop in San Francisco. Dorothy C, a lithograph made by the artist in 1938, is a cubist rendering of a woman's body marching through space, a highly abstracted figure set amidst intersecting planes and undulating lines. The tip of Dorothy C's small black shoes barely touch the frame line of the print, and the right toe points at the H of the artist's signature. An ellipse of a hat perches on her head, colored black with an undulating plume of white across its apex, vaguely reminiscent in its kidney shape of an artist's palette. But perhaps also it is a thought bubble, or a plume of cigarette smoke, or a passing bit of San Francisco's famous fog. Dorothy C's head is comprised of several sharply arcing lines, and covered by cross-hatching that reveals little more than the dot of an eye and the crisp point of a long nose. Her hair is tucked within a snood that repeats the cross-hatched pattern of the veil, the two mixing together in a mass of overlapping lines. This mask-like visage tilts downward toward a large, open, bifold newspaper, made recognizable as such by the subtle indications of article columns scribbled on its surface. Dorothy C is given only a first name and a last initial. Like the cross-hatched veil that both creates and obscures her face, she is only partly knowable, only partly visible. Throughout the composition, Johnson has shaded the various areas to create depth in overlap and forms, while leaving untouched the space between the formal lines that make up Dorothy C's hands and the voluptuously rounded legs, in order to retain the white color of the paper on which it is printed. These shapely gams, here I'm referring to her legs, seem to emerge from the bifurcating lines of the parallel planes that make up the skirt to end in those little black shoes. Dorothy C exists just outside of our reach, her feet not quite touching the ground, her head in the clouds, a phantom dancing through the space of the modern city as the fragmented lines of the city streets rise and fall behind her. She is a spectral figure, a body through which we can see, held together by a linear border, a transparent space, a crystalline vessel. The whiteness of the page that remains visible after having felt the hard press of the cleanly wiped stone of the lithographer. The enigmatic and almost invisible Dorothy C is a product both of Sargent Johnson's imagination and of the print studio at the FAP, which began funding artists to create public works, easel paintings, and prints in 1935. Between that time and 1943, when the program ended, Johnson was lucky to find work in their sponsored studios. In the 1910s, he had worked as a Pullman porter or a dining car waiter, and by the 1920s, he was also making frames for the Schussler brothers' San Francisco gallery. But the depth of the Depression in the 1930s saw him seek out work from the government. The FAP paid modestly, and it gave artists a chance to participate in large-scale public decoration. And many of the artists in the exhibition at the museum right now participated in the FAP and the Federal Art Project. This extensive state-sponsored commissioning was something that had no previous parallel in the history of American art. Johnson participated in a variety of Federal Art Project projects, including the aquatic park bathhouse, eventually becoming one of only 2 African Americans in the entire country to rise to the level of Federal Art Project supervisor. The FAP was charged with beautifying the country's buildings and municipal spaces by employing out-of-work artists to create murals, monumental and decorative sculpture, and other material embellishments, including easel paintings and prints. It was in the FAP studio that the majority of Johnson's lithographs, including this one, were made between 36 and 41 when the program was active. For the most part, the WPA in the Bay Area did not discriminate on racial grounds in their hiring, but that did not mean that it was easy to secure employment with the agency. Johnson's friend, the African-American journalist, Thomas C. Fleming, was also able to get on with the WPA, and I show him to you here on the left. And he said, this is a quote from Fleming, "I got a WPA job right away and dug ditches for 1 or 2 days. Then they found out I had more than 2 years of college and that I had done some writing for the Oakland Tribune. So they sent me out to the Federal Writers Project at the Bancroft Library on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. It paid $94 a month. That was the top pay they gave you on the WPA. The unskilled workers got about $60 a month." Fleming realized his good fortune at being employed by the government, it being a less racist environment than the private sector. Quote, The job only lasted about 6 months because the funds ran out for that particular project. I was the only Black person in the group, and they accepted me as a colleague. But even though I did the same work as they did for the WPA, I knew I could not get a job on a daily newspaper because there were only two in the country that had hired Black reporters, the Boston Globe and the New York Post. Toward the end of his life, when Johnson was asked about his own experience in the WPA, he echoed Fleming's sentiments regarding the unique opportunity that these programs had offered the few African Americans they employ. But he also hinted at the difficulty in simply getting hired on. Quote, I came over to San Francisco and well, then I met Hilaire, who I show you up in the upper left. Johnson remembered he wanted to know why I wasn't on the WPA. And I said, well, I went down and they wouldn't take me. But he said, all right, you go on with me tomorrow and I'll see that you get on. So I went with Hilaire and I was allowed on, given a job. Hilaire and Johnson would go on to work together at the Aquatic Park Bathhouse, Johnson creating the exterior tile murals with Hilaire painting the interior walls. During the late 1930s, while working for the FAP, Johnson began to create the lithographs in the studio. These reveal his interest in the formal techniques of synthetic cubism and his desire to incorporate motifs and modes derived from African art, such as masking, in conjunction with contemporary African American New Negro movement cultural themes of racial two-ness and social masking. One of these prints, White and Black, won the $25 Artist Fund Prize of the annual exhibition of drawings and prints held by the San Francisco Art Association in 1938. It is an image that defies easy characterization. It is both male and female, Black and white, as though two bodies had become fused together into a matrix of intersecting lines, some straight, others curved, creating overlapping planes. The shapes made by these planar slices of form hint at the socialized body. Some of them contain fragmentary patterns or various levels of shading, white to gray to black, that mimic an item of clothing, some hair, or another marker of culturally inscribed identity. Alternating stripes of black and white recall the ribbon trim of a floor-length skirt. Consecutive circles on a conical slice recall the studs of a man's vest. A warmly shaded S curve at its tail ending in three sharp cut packs evokes the profile of a face. Along the left side of the profile, marking its border, is half of an arcing line that completes a white and black ovoid form, a small slit on its right side, perhaps a hole through which an eye might peek, breaking its surface. And here I'm referring to this space up there, the kind of mask-like face. The juxtaposition of this form and the profile suggests double lives and metaphorical masks behind which African Americans have lived in order to protect our true selves from the gaze of those who might attempt to oppress us or define us as less than human. It was, quote, a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, wrote W.E.B. Du Bois in his influential book, The Souls of Black Folks. Quote, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two warring souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, close quote. Du Bois's idea of two-ness or double consciousness echoes the contemporary poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar. In his 1896 poem, We Wear the Mask, Dunbar laments, we wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. Johnson's two-ness came not just from being Black and American, but also from having Black and white parents, as mentioned previously. His mother was primarily of African descent, and his understanding was that his father may have had primarily Swedish origins. The title of the lithograph, Black and White, inverts the more common phrase, or excuse me, I just did that. The title of the lithograph, White and Black, inverts the more common phrase, Black and White. That is so often used to describe grayscale reproductions in photograph and the graphic arts. But it also hints at the presence of something hidden. I mean, not just white, but also Black, as though there were a part of the subject that was obscured or hidden behind the other. During the 1930s, Johnson made numerous masks, many using beaten copper sheets and abstracted forms that echoed African masks. In the 1920s, the display of African art and masks in particular was still very rare in the United States. In 1910, and I apologize that this slide is a little bit blurry, but it's the best reproduction I could get. In 1910, the African Hall opened at New York City's American Museum of Natural History. And in 1914, the photographer and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz mounted an exhibition of African Negro art at his Manhattan Gallery 291. And between 1916 and 1917, the Mexican-born artist Marius de Zayas organized a series of exhibitions that included works of African sculpture at the Modern Gallery before opening his own gallery, where he exhibited such works for the next 5 years. In 1923, the Brooklyn Museum published a catalog of primitive Negro art in their collection, which consisted primarily of objects from what was then called the Belgian Congo. There were also a small number of books of African art that were circulating in the United States, including Carl Einstein's 1910 volume Neger Plastique. However, prior to the 1926, there was no significant scholarly acknowledgement or display of African art that was accessible on the West Coast of the United States. And Johnson's interaction with African art would have come only through travel to New York through reproductions. Because Johnson worked as a railroad employee on and off through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, serving as either a dining car waiter or a Pullman porter, he may have seen African art in person at a stopover in New York City. While he was loath to acknowledge this particular day job publicly, it was an occupation that allowed him a high level of geographic mobility. So it is not beyond the realm of possibility that he could have seen works of African art in person during this period. In spite of the paucity of African source material to be seen firsthand in the United States between the world wars, Johnson found a way to incorporate African design into his art. And I believe that this came through the important volume, The New Negro, the influential 1924 anthology conceived and edited by the Harvard-trained philosopher, Rhodes Scholar, and Howard University professor, Alain Locke. Locke knew Johnson's maternal uncle, the economist William Tecumseh Sherman Jackson, great name, who was Locke's colleague at Howard in Washington, D.C. And present in this important book, which I think was probably given to Johnson by his uncle, were reproductions of 6 pieces of African art from the collection of Albert C. Barnes, 2 of which I show you here. Dr. Barnes was notoriously reluctant to allow reproductions of his work in his collection to circulate, so it is highly significant that he made these images available for the publication in The New Negro. And this is the Dr. Barnes of the Barnes Foundation here in Philadelphia. In the layout of the book, most of these images were placed alongside Alain Locke's germinal essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts. This essay served as the philosopher's manifesto on the importance of African art to the creation of a distinctly modern and uniquely Negro visual art aesthetic. Locke had spent time in England and Europe prior to the First World War and had the opportunity to visit many of the great ethnographic collections of African material culture while abroad. And these are all collections today which are very much in dispute. And if you follow news about repatriating Benin bronzes, for example, and sending them back to Nigeria, this was not a question in the 19th or in the early 20th century, and now it's very much part of the discourse. So Locke begins the legacy of the ancestral arts by arguing for the primacy of the oral with an A and oral with an O tradition in African American culture. But then he quickly moves to a discussion on the visual arts, and he says, quote, music and poetry, and to an extent the dance, have been the predominant arts of the American Negro. This is an emphasis quite different from that of African cultures, where the plastic and the crafts are predominant. Africa being on one of the great fountains sources of the arts of decoration and design. He goes on to argue that in idiom, technical treatment, and objective social angle, African American artists must make a bold iconoclastic break with the current traditions that have grown up about the Negro subject in American art. It is not meant to dictate a style to the young Negro artist, but to point the lesson that contemporary European art has already learned. That any vital artistic expression of the Negro theme and subject in art must break through the stereotypes to a new style, distinctive, fresh technique, and some sort of characteristic idiom, close quote. And then he goes on to expand on the importance of African art to the modern European avant-garde. He expresses the hope that, quote, that the sensitive artistic mind of the American Negro, stimulated by a cultural pride and interest, will receive from African art a profound and galvanizing influence. The legacy is there, at least with prospects for a rich yield. Visual resonances can be easily seen between Johnson's masks and the works of African art that were reproduced in the New Negro. And I encourage you to go and see Mask, which is not on this screen, but is in the exhibition at WAM. The sculptor has translated the shininess of the wood accrued through years of natural handling by users into the warm glow of the copper from which he pounded out his own. This change in materials may be attributed to Johnson's misreading of the reproductions, which bore no descriptive labels beyond sometimes these apocryphal attributions to various African groups. In his study of the designs produced by these African carvers, Johnson was evidently drawn to the oval shapes, linear patterning, and smooth planar abstraction that they favored, creating Art Deco versions of African art. Because there were no public or private collections of African art in California in the 1920s and 30s that would have been available to him, it seems highly likely that these objects from the Barnes collection, as published in the New Negro, served to inform his practice. The African-inspired masks made by Johnson in the 20s and 30s, like the abstracted human forms that are found in white and black, are indebted to the synthetic cubism of Picasso, with that mode's tendency to not only break an image apart into different planes, but to also push it together into a flattened shared space. In white and black, rather than taking apart a single figure, Johnson merges two seemingly opposites into one body: a man's suit with a woman's dress, a black face with a white mask. But it is an African style mask, one that hints at the artistic journey the artist has taken during the preceding decades as his artistic identity and interests grew. In this work, Johnson found a way to combine both the personal and the political beliefs that had shaped his life thus far. He sutures these disparate elements together, making it difficult for the viewer to identify whether the shaded profile belongs to the body of a woman or a man, the self or the other, that which is known or that which is hidden. The ambiguity witnessed in white and black is also found in the equally inexplicable Dorothy C, which has been described by art historian Leslie King Hammond as, quote, an abstract and stylized composition that clearly reflects Johnson's deep love for his people, close quote. Now here, this quote is taken from the main essay in the 1989 exhibition catalog, Black Printmakers and the WPA. King Hammond implies that as one of the, quote, Black printmakers of the show's title, Johnson's people are Black, and therefore the subject of Dorothy C is Black as well. King Hammond provides us with a reflexive reading of the figure as that of an African American. But what are we to make of the print if the specific Dorothy C, to whom the painting title, or to who the print's title refers, what if Dorothy C was not in fact a woman of African descent? Which of Johnson's people would she then represent? The Black people of his mother's family, or the white ancestors of his fathers, or the variety of people with whom he associated in the multiracial San Francisco art world of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, such as Thomas C. Fleming, who was Black, and Hilaire Hilaire, who was white. I would argue that given the visual evidence, the lack of any shading on the legs, hands, or face of Dorothy C, that this might indicate which might indicate the presence of African blood. His subject was most probably a white woman. And given the artist's use of a first name and a last initial, it is probably the portrait of a specific white woman. Either the painter Dorothy Cravath, a San Francisco artist of German descent with whom Johnson was friends and colleagues for nearly 50 years, or possibly Dorothy Collins, a publicist who managed the Federal Arts Project offices in Northern California between 33 and 45, and supervised at least one of the program's murals, the Enlisted Men's Club at Fort Ord. Born in Texas in 1901, before relocating with her family to Half Moon Bay, California as a child, for most of her career, our first Dorothy was professionally known by her married name, Puccinelli. She was a gifted artist who studied alongside Johnson at the California School of Fine Arts in the early 1920s. She was also a writer and an art critic, which may account for the newspaper that the female figure in Dorothy C clutches in her gloved hands. During the late 1930s, Dorothy Cravath participated in several WPA FAP projects, including the cycle of murals depicting animals boarding Noah's Ark that she made with Helen Forbes for the Mother's House at Fleischacker Zoo in 1936, and a mural of California history, which is located in the main post office at Merced, California. The Mother's House murals are mentioned in a Los Angeles Times article from 1936, just a few sentences away from a reference to a different FAP project that Johnson was being considered for, a set of mosaic murals at the administration building for the Golden Gate Bridge. In fact, Johnson had been assigned to a job at the zoo during the same time that Dorothy and Edith Hamlin were painting, but Johnson's project was never completed. It, quote, was a whole series of animals. This is him describing it. It was a whole series of animals on one of the squares on each side. So when you went through, you could see all those carved animals like we had in the zoo. Excuse me. Only we couldn't get the money. However, that didn't stop him from watching his lady friends at work. Quote, I used to go there to watch them paint, he later recalled when asked about the WPA projects at Fleischacker Zoo. Between 1935 and 41, Johnson is believed to have pulled the print of Dorothy C. And during that time, Dorothy Cravath and her first husband, Raymond Puccinelli, a sometime actor and sculptor, separated. Raymond Raymond went to New York to study art, and Dorothy lived as a single woman in an apartment at 44A Greenwich Street on Telegraph Hill. She remained single for several years before eventually marrying Wallace Chick Cravath, the brother of sculptor Ruth Cravath, who I show you here in a beautiful picture by Imogen Cunningham. When interviewed about her sister-in-law in 1963, Ruth Cravath, who had been close friends with her since the 1920s, recalled her in highly romantic terms. Quote, "But speaking of Dorothy and her ability to do fine things and so forth, she was just an absolutely superb craftsman, you know. She had a beautiful, absolute manual control of everything, just absolutely. For 50 years, I have watched that woman, and I'm sure you have too, with a drink in her hand, twirling the glass like this," and she gestured, "and the liquid would go up and down. And for 50 years, I held my breath and never did once a drop go over the glass. You remember how she always did that with the drink, always. I mean, a glass of sherry or a glass of wine or any glass, she would twirl the glass like this. And of course, the liquid would move around and around and around. Oh, sometimes I used to get a little nervous, but for the 50 years that I've known her, never did a drop go over the glass. That's a great example of her manual dexterity, her manual control. I wouldn't dare do that. It would spill right away." The magnetism of the young divorcee who gaily swirled her wine glass at parties may have been irresistible for Johnson, who had also separated from his wife, Pearl, in 1936. While it is possible that the painter Dorothy Piccinelli Cravath was the subject of the print, Dorothy C, it is even more likely that Dorothy Collins, the manager at the FAP offices, was its inspiration. Collins was also a divorcee and was responsible for distributing the prints and easel paintings that artists created under the project auspices for display in regional libraries, schools, and municipal buildings. She was a favorite of the WPA artists that she worked with, appearing here as a fashionably dressed woman lounging on a park bench next to project director William Gaskins in Lucien Lebeau's 1936 mural at the Beach Chalet at Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Although Collins sits alongside Gaskins, the two do not appear to be a couple. Her long arm drapes over the back of the bench, extending an offering of a nut to a squirrel while he rests his forearms on its upper rail. Elegantly gray in her mid-40s, Lebeau depicts Collins as a silver-haired woman in a royal purple coat topped by a fox fur collar that matches her hair. The arc of the collar extends down her arm to the squirrel below, creating a sympathetic relationship between the two. That Johnson and Collins were close is demonstrated by her acquisition sometime in the 1940s of at least one group of Johnson's ceramics, including a teapot of a hybrid pre-Columbian design with a jaguar handle and a vaguely anthropomorphic head, which is now in the collection of the Oakland Museum of California. The teapot was one of a series of vessels that Johnson created in his own Mesoamerican style shortly after working on the court of Pacifica at the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island in 1939. A photograph of the exposition shows the large-scale Incan figures that Johnson had designed and executed. These Inca riding on the backs of llamas, are variations on a theme. One plays characteristic reed pipes while the other holds the reins of his mount. The second llama on the right in the photograph has its mouth open as though braying, much in the same way that the jaws of the abstracted jaguar handle fall open on Dorothy Collins's teapot. And here I have a slightly better picture. Dorothy Collins's teapot may have originally been paired with a set of cups, similar to the two that survive here with a nearly identical, but a different one, nearly identical teapot, which is currently in a private collection. And this teapot actually just sold about 2 years ago on the market. It was in the collection of Melvin Holmes, and now it's gone someplace else, but it sold for $50,000, which is a record for a small ceramic like this by Johnson. The cups are cylindrical in design, with flat-sided handles and rectangular flanges that jut out on the opposite side. Their exterior ochre glaze, which matches that of the pot they accompany, is set off by a cream-colored interior. One of the cups is decorated with an abstract pattern of lines, dots, and chevrons, while the other hosts a scene of two silhouetted lovers sitting on a park bench. The dark bodies appear to merge into each other. The male figure strums a guitar made visible as an outline against the ochre glaze. Although formally different, the motif of the guitar that appears on the teacup is similar to the guitar strumming figures of another of Johnson's lithographs. Made in the FAP print workshop, Singing Saints from 1940, here is more romantically, the cups is more romantically suggestive than spiritually so, with the head of the musician leaning in towards his companion as he serenades her. So I'm saying this is more romantic than this. As we've seen, the 1930s and early 40s were busy times for Sargent Johnson. Not only was he working on large-scale public projects and making lithographs in the FAP's workshop, he was also making copper masks inspired by reproductions of African models and Mesoamerican-derived tea sets in his Oakland studio. At the same time, he was learning to play the guitar, which might account for his interest in repeatedly depicting it in Singing Saints and on the teacups. By casting these serenading figures in black silhouette, Johnson has obscured their identities even more completely than he did when he absented the details of Dorothy C's facial features behind the crosshatched lines of her veil, making her into a nearly invisible woman. Like Dorothy C, the identity of Johnson's two lovers remains unrecoverable, lost to time. What is clear, however, is Johnson's artistic interest in developing both an African-inspired New Negro art that adhered to Alain Locke's prescriptions and depicting aspects of his own modern life in a way that often obscured its overt realities, cloaking his more personal work in a code of initials and purposefully oblique titles. I would argue that Dorothy C and White and Black both hint at the artist's interest in interracial relationships, such as the one between his mother, Eliza, and his father, Anderson, and perhaps also his own desire for a relationship with a woman named Dorothy, a relationship about which he could not be completely transparent in the America of the 1930s and 40s. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen for a minute and switch you all to gallery view. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Dr. Shaw, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I feel just abrim with questions, and perhaps I'll start as we wait for the chat to start buzzing. Why do you think Johnson has had a period of relative obscurity compared to, you know, some of those other interwar artists? And do you think he's, you know, ripe for a moment?
Yeah, I think so. You know, sculpture, I think, often gets, you know, plays second fiddle to paintings. Okay. And so the painters who have been really prominent in the last few years, like Aaron Douglas, or Archibald Motley, or Alan Rohan Cricht, you know, it's the analysis and the discussion of their work, which for the most part is, you know, very representational, very straightforward, like the Cricht painting, which, is it still behind you? It was behind you the other day. Yep. Yeah. My eyesight is not so great.
Right there.
You know, you see these children, these people on the block, you understand the scene, you know what's going on. And Johnson's work, because a lot of it is very highly abstracted, is much more ambiguous. And it's been a little bit less easy for people to interpret. He was also working on the West Coast, and the artists who are on the East Coast, as you probably know, being in Kansas, right? That the coasts get a lot of attention, but particularly the East Coast. Yeah. And I really see his connection to the period of the Harlem Renaissance, and the New Negro movement as only being possible because he had East Coast connections, because his uncle was at Howard. His aunt, his uncle's wife, was a woman named May Howard Jackson, who was also an artist. And I think that she tipped him off to a lot of the exhibitions and opportunities that were happening that he would not have heard about on the West Coast. And he spends a lot of time going back and forth across the country. He, working on the railroad, leaving from the terminus in Oakland and going to New York. He has a lot of relatives in Chicago. But because he's outside of that East Coast, like truly Harlem Renaissance matrix, he gets left out of a lot of the discussions that happen in that moment. But because he's connected, he's sending work back and it gets seen. So it gets reproduced in their in the catalogs. And because he has this relationship with, let me go back and share screen again, because he has this relationship with Alain Locke, and I'm going to just escape. Oh, it's not letting me. Here, oh, there we go. Let me just go up to the top. Because he knows Locke, he ends up being reproduced a lot in Locke's work. So for example, and I'll go back into the share screen. There we go. You can see here the frontispiece for Alain Locke's The Negro in Art is a drawing by Johnson. So he has this support of the, of the Black intelligentsia. But because he's West Coast, I think he just kind of gets overlooked. Also, his work has been collected in very, specific locations. So, for example, the majority of his work is held, well, when I say majority, I mean like 7 pieces. That's the largest concentration right now, is at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The Oakland Museum has about 3 pieces, and then most of the rest are in private collections or, they're in museums now. But 10 or 15 years ago, they were mostly in private hands. So I think it was very difficult for scholars who were not in California, were not focused on California artists, to begin to, to think about him. So part of it's subject matter, part of it is geographic location, and part of it is sculpture, just and prints, being second and third to painting.
Well, and because Dr. Shaw, the way you spoke about how the extraordinary connections between the mask and the idea of two-ness and double consciousness, I mean, it just seems like it's begging for a ton of attention. And then even just seeing it, in our own galleries, it's exquisite. The crafts, I mean, it's just the mask that's here is just exquisite. Well, it looks like we have a question from the audience. The mask in the Wham exhibit has openings instead of eyes, and it appears that the 2 masks you showed also have openings instead of eyes. Would you interpret that decision in a particular way?
Well, some of his masks do. They have eyes, and others don't. And so maybe the ones that have eyes aren't really masks, right? And they're kind of, more sculptures of faces. The one in your exhibition has a back to it also, right? And it's on a little stand. And that one is really unique in being in the round and having a back to it. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of my graduate students presented her dissertation work, which is on African art in Europe in the 1910s and 20s, and she showed a picture of masks based on African masks that had been made by Hilaire Lair, by Johnson's friend, but they had been made in the 1920s, in the early 20s in Paris before the two men knew each other. So now I'm beginning to think that there's a possibility that in addition to being introduced to this work in reproduction through Locke, that Johnson was also connecting with Hilaire Lair and looking at what this white artist who was very immersed in African American and in African culture, to see what that artist was doing. Hilaire Lair, when he lived in Paris, he owned a club, a bar called the Jockey Club, which was a jazz club, and Hilaire Lair was a jazz musician also. That club is the subject of a painting by Archibald Motley called The Jockey Club. So if you've ever seen that, that's Hilaire Lair's club in Paris. And so I think that, you know, we tend to think about artists working in really segregated ways in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and they weren't, you know. Sure, some of them, there are plenty of racist artists out there who, you know, in the early 20th century, who did not, you know, like white artists who did not have Black friends and Black associations, but there were lots who did, and vice versa. And Johnson always was part of these interracial communities in San Francisco because it was a very kind of tolerant and interconnected community, in part because it was so small. And so, you know, I think that there are a lot of ways that we can, you know, if we begin to think about not only the kind of the interracial reality of somebody like Johnson, who had a white father and a Black mother, who was born in the 1880s. You know, this is not a new phenomenon, right? But was used to living in mixed communities and, you know, and engaging. And so were his friends, like Hilaire Lair. So, you know, I think that there are these ways that, you know, when you begin to look at these forms that he created, that it really is about exploring, about figuring out what you can do. What happens if you put eyes? What happens if you don't? Is this really supposed to be in front of a face, or is it standing in for a face? And what are the materials that we're working on? If it's, you know, shiny and it's wood, can I also make it out of copper and have it be shiny? And, you know, is it the shininess that's the important thing? Or is it the, you know, the forms, these geometric forms? And, you know, and trying to, you know, struggling with, how do I be part, you know, how can I be part of this movement that's happening on the other side of the country? You know, how can I do that? How can I engage these forms and still, you know, stay true to my own interests as an artist? So I think that's part of what he's exploring there.
I love that. I love that. Dr. Shaw, can you tell us? So the reading of the print as, you know, sort of a space of kind of personal longing and perhaps, you know, romantic, you know, thwarted romantic impulses. But you mentioned that he was married. So do we think he, you know, cast aside the wife for Dorothy C, or what happened to Mrs. Johnson?
So Pearl is a sad story. Pearl Johnson was born in Mobile, Alabama, and she came from really, 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 really kind of desperate circumstances and worked her way up through life as a manicurist. And she goes to San Francisco, and she meets him there, and they get married. And in the census records, you see them there, and often they're listed as a white couple because he can pass. And if so, you know, like if the census taker came by and they weren't home, the neighbor might have answered and said, oh, they're white, you know, because they look white, but they weren't. And Pearl is always really interested in being a part of middle class Black society. And she becomes a club woman. One of the few mentions of her in the newspaper is about her hosting a bridge party, the card game bridge. And she wants to be, very upstanding and middle class. And Sargent wants to be a bohemian artist. He's a big drinker. He likes to hang out in North Beach in the Italian neighborhood there with his buddies, knocking back the anchor beers, right? And this is a big issue for them. And she gets very upset with him because he'll bring friends over to their house and they'll be sitting in the backyard with jug wine. And she's like, this is not okay.
Right. But I was having the bridge ladies over and I had the silver out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Pearl is clutching her pearls. And and it makes her kind of crazy. And it's really sad because she's never able to move into the lifestyle that she wants with him. And she actually, her life ends in a mental hospital, in an asylum in the Bay Area, in in one of these
tragic
20th century, mental hospitals that they closed. Like this place closed a long time ago after, horror stories. He goes and he visits her. First they're estranged, then they get divorced, and then she ends up in the hospital. And he visits her a lot until she dies. But he was also a ladies' man, and his friends do write about that. So I don't know if maybe that contributed to her mental illness, but definitely the class stuff and, being with an artist who was a drinker and a bit of a womanizer, and who had no interest in, giving her the life that she wanted beyond a certain point.
Poor Pearl.
Yeah, kind of stinks. I feel bad for her. She tried really hard and she had a hard life.
Well, Dr. Shaw, it looks like since we don't have any more questions in the chat, I will let you get on with your evening and your dinner there on the East Coast. And thank you for sharing this remarkable talk with us and giving us a peek into this great sculpture that we have in the show. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I'm sorry, Ellie says here that the piece is open in the back. The mask is open in the back. That's been how long it's been since I've seen the piece. So I can't wait. I know this show has been traveling the country.
Yes.
And so that's a marvelous piece. It's a fantastic exhibition. And I hope that folks go and see it since you guys are open, which is so cool.
So exciting. We're open, we're safe, we're no touch, we have high ceilings, everyone's masked, and so we've been safe. We've been safe and a nice respite for people to come. So
good. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw.